Welcome back to another lecture. Here I'm going to summarize some key points that I want you to hold for week one. And I want to begin specifically with the concept of price and how important the role that price plays in the marketplace. Many of you wrote about that in your post, rightfully so. Good job, by the way. And for many of you that were active, for some of you that you weren't, you've got to pick it up, of course. But I want to talk about the role of price, and to do so, I want to refer to a couple of paragraphs out of a book by Milton Friedman, one of my favorite economists, because I'm a free market person. And in his book, Free to Choose, written in 1979 with his wife Rose, he writes, Adam Smith's flash of genius was his recognition that the prices that emerged from voluntary transaction between buyers and sellers, for short, in a free market, could coordinate the activity of millions of people, each seeking his own interest in such a way as to make everyone better off. Well, that's the invisible hand, by the way, that everybody better off, which is sort of an unintended consequence, but one that occurs. It was a startling idea then, and it remains one today. That economic order can emerge as the unintended consequence of the actions of many people, each seeking his own interest. The price system works so well, so efficiently, that we are not aware of it most of the time. We never realize how well it functions until it's prevented from functioning, and even then we seldom recognize the source of the trouble. Prices perform three functions in organizing economic activity. First, they transmit information, i.e., if the price goes up, we buy less. We've just told then the suppliers we're not going to buy more at that price, so we've effective form of communication. Second, they provide an incentive to adopt those methods of production that are least costly and thereby use available resources for the most highly valued purposes. Interesting idea to think about that. Partly, it means that there's an incentive to suppliers to find an efficient form of production, because by being efficient, they're able to lower their price and sell more. Well, let's see, where was I? And third, they determine who gets, i.e. price, determines who gets how much of the product, i.e. the distribution of income. These three functions are closely interrelated. So if the price of goods is high, then only those that have means will buy them, versus if prices are all low, then there's more equality because now everybody can buy. Price, extremely important. Now I want you to turn to page 37 in your text. We're going to talk about something that's related, and that's this up here in this table up here, and it's called the production possibilities curve. Let's take a look what it has to say. So we're looking at this table at the top where we see housing and food units. And then the idea here is that if resources are limited, then each entity, whether it's you, time is limited, food's limited, income's limited, we still have to decide how are we going to allocate it. If you think about time, you could spend all 24 hours of your time studying with a certain outcome, or you could split your time, 12 studying and 12 doing other things. And so there would be various outcomes associated with that, right? In this case, if we're looking at this table, let's imagine that our resource is labor. And it's saying, with combination A, that if we used all of our labor resource to just do housing, we could create 10 housing units. And we would generate zero food because nothing's being allocated there. On the other hand, at the flip side, at the very bottom, combination E says if we give all of our labor resources to food, we can generate 80 units, and of course nothing to food, and then we get these, or housing, and then we get these various combinations in between. The point is, it turns out, if we think about one-to-one equivalency, that we're far more efficient, productive with our resources being allocated to food than we are with housing units. So in the event that we could trade our food for somebody else that can produce housing more efficiently, then that's a fair trade and both parties are better off. And those are the examples of competitive or comparative or absolute advantage, which we'll read about later. Excuse me, I gotta let my cat out. He just, Toby, let's say hello here. Before I let you out. I want to say hello to everybody. There's Toby. Toby's about 18. Still hanging in there. All right, you can leave. Go on. There you go. Go on out. So if you then turn to the next page on the top right, there you are, page. There we see an example of the production possibilities curve being either expanded or contracted. Of course, this would vary based on price and other demand qualities in the marketplace. Think about production of agricultural products. As various conditions change, farmers will produce more or less of various crops, both globally as well as domestically. So that's an important idea about how our production capabilities are going to be influenced by various capacities, largely again driven by price, and how that influences demand. Let's then turn to page 50. I want to talk about the shifts in the demand curve. Now remember, in the demand curve, it's always downward sloping. So if this is the price axis and this is the quantity axis, or the quantity axis is down below, so then as price goes up, if you will, so as price goes up, our quantity demand go down. As price goes down, quantity demand goes up, and you understand. So it's always downward sloping. We're always going to buy less when the price is lower. Quantity is going to go up. But there are these various factors that influence price and demand. And let's take a look at these 5 that are listed here on page 50. First one says changes in price and related goods and services. So that one's pretty self-explanatory, as the price of goods changes. But we can also think about if the price of, for example, complementary products. When we buy peanut butter, we're more likely to buy jelly. If we buy hamburger or hot dogs, we're more likely to buy hot dog buns. So as the price of one goes up, the quantity demand of the other can go down. So sort of that's the example of related goods. Changes of income. As our wages go up, we become a little less price sensitive, and our quantity demand rises. So that can push out the yield curve, or excuse me, the demand curve, as opposed to contracted. During the recession, lots of unemployment people, the demand curve for lots of goods contracted. Post-recession, 5% unemployment, the demand curve expanding. Changes in the number of buyers. Same idea. The more buyers there are, the more competition for goods there can be, or there can be greater productivity related to supplying those buyers, and price can come down. Changes in taste. When I think about this one, I think about when the Atkins diet, low-carb diet, sort of swept the United States. When you could go into Burger King and get a Whopper wrapped in lettuce. I mean, how silly was that? But it was an example of how taste changed demand, and we're seeing a significant impact on the food industry overall as we demand things like gluten-free and organic, things without preservatives, more natural. All those things are shifting. Our tastes are shifting, and the supply side is rapidly trying to adapt to our tastes, and prices are associatedly different relative to those changes in taste. And finally, changes in expectation. If you're optimistic about your future, you're feeling very good about your job security and wage growth, then you're more likely to have a greater demand for goods, pushes out to the demand curve. Same thing on the other side. If we think we're going to lose a job, things aren't going so well, then obviously we're going to buy less, more price sensitive, contraction of the demand curve. Pretty straightforward. If we go to page 56, same idea, but now we're on the supplier side. 5 conditions that can influence the participation of suppliers, willingness to supply. Changes in the seller's input price. So the cost of the goods that the seller uses to produce whatever it is they sell, if those prices rise and they can't pass that change in price on to the consumer, then they're not going to produce as much. And we can think about that with the impact of rising wages in the form of higher minimum wage. Second one, changes in the prices of related goods and services. So as you think about substitutes or competitive products, as the price of one product changes relative to what another product is sold for, then I might sell less, I might sell more. Changes in expectations, same idea. If I'm optimistic supplier and I believe the market's going to grow and have a bigger demand for what I sell, then I'm going to produce more. The number of sellers. So if I'm the only game in town, I can sell it for whatever I want. The more competitors I have, I become then more subject to price competition. I have to become more efficient, more cost effective. Changes my willingness or capabilities to supply. I may not even be able to participate. I may have to exit the market. And changes in technology. Certainly technology has changed a lot of the cost factors associated with business. And if I can reduce my overall operating costs through technology, then I can lower my price because my margin is still the same. I still want 20% margin. I've been able to lower my production costs through technology. I can lower my price, perhaps take more market share, perhaps sell more goods. So that's another important factor. Last thing I want to mention has to do with sort of in this general concept of price elasticity, or our willingness to pay. This is discussed on page 89. And the role, again, that the price plays in this. So really critical on the supplier side, understanding and figuring out how to capture our different willingness to pay. I mentioned in one of my posts that if I'm in the airport and I have a splitting headache, it doesn't matter what I have to pay for aspirin, more or less. I'm going to pay, or Tylenol, I'm going to pay that price. So in other words, it's pretty straightforward, pretty obvious, as suppliers know, given a captive audience like those in an airport, particularly those on the other side of security, that their willingness to pay is much different than if you're outside of that space, you have free access to all competitors. Your willingness to pay is then obviously going to be different. So the idea is for suppliers to figure out, how can I capture that difference? Well, variable pricing, which we see in the airlines industry, hotels, and increasingly in other industries, is one way to do that, using algorithms to capture our willingness to pay based on knowing what time of day is, people most likely to want to do something, what day of the week. If you were, for example, if you were traveling to Cleveland for something unrelated to the Republican convention or Philadelphia for the Democratic convention, you would have gotten caught in the algorithms that were effectively increasing the price because of the awareness that there were people specifically coming to Philadelphia or Cleveland for those conventions, and therefore they had to pay whatever they could be charged. You just being a visitor going there to travel to visit family got caught in that higher price relative to the known demand by the algorithms. So these systems sometimes obviously don't always work specifically to those that have a willingness to pay. We get caught into that funnel, so to speak, that the system understands and can manipulate. Where the old joke is, you never ask the person next to you on an airplane what they paid for their ticket, because either you're going to feel good or you're going to feel bad, depending on what you paid. And the fact is that you can have 200 seats on a plane and not one person paid the same price. And this has been another shift relative to airlines of willingness to pay. As a bank consultant, I did years and years of travel, and one of the things I saw in the past year was finding out my willingness to pay for another couple of inches of legroom. They would assign me a seat and then offer me these other seats for $25 or $35. And they found out I had a willingness to pay for those few more inches of comfort or position on the plane. We're going to increasingly see this, by the way, industries mining their data for opportunities to determine our willingness to pay. A very simple example of this that's been going on for some time is The individual that's not willing to pay a higher price to see a movie after 7 o'clock, but wants to see the movie and is willing to see it at 4 o'clock. And as a result, since there are fewer people that watch a movie that will go to a movie theater at 4 o'clock, they're given a better price because their willingness to pay a higher price isn't there. So the theater industry has learned how to bifurcate their pricing, differentiating based on willingness to pay. We see that in the restaurant industry as well, and so forth. So we get that, but we're going to increasingly see more and more of that. This is becoming true in certainly in the athletic market, where if the Trailblazers are playing the Lakers, or now the Cleveland Cavaliers, maybe more so, the price of those tickets is higher than if they were playing the Sacramento Kings or some lower team that there is fewer interest. So the willingness to pay to see the Cleveland Cavaliers is higher than the willingness to see the Sacramento Kings, and the system, of course, understands that and builds in pricing accordingly. By the way, that willingness to pay there's an interesting concept called consumer surplus. So there's a difference between what the sort of the marginal or market price is versus what our willingness to pay or what we end up paying. So the difference between the market price and what we pay is called the consumer surplus. Sort of being able to capture that above what the market price is. Again, it's very interesting, very different. The market price for an airline ticket might be $300, but because I need to go tomorrow, my willingness to pay might be $500. So there's a $200 in consumer surplus difference between the market and what I paid. Same thing happens on the supplier side. Well, those are some other takeaways that above and beyond what I talked about in my other video. So as we finish up this week, again, pricing, understanding economic vocabulary and concepts, price elasticity, incentives, opportunity cost, just to name a few of the key ones are the ones that you need to hold. Now, next week we'll be talking about chapters 6, 7, 8, and 9, getting into more of some of the technical side of economics, in part about what it takes on the supplier side to stay in business. So cost, marginal cost, variable cost, fixed cost, some of those sorts of discussions we'll be reading about. Anyway, till next time, keep posting and see you there. Bye.